very, very much, Yancy. And thank you for the opportunity to present. And I just from listening to the previous speaker, the professor, I mean, this is something that there's been a lot of work in this area, particularly because we are presently experiencing all this turmoil in the world. And I think from a perspective department, I'll just demonstrate why we need to respond to this, to this virus, and then the way forward in terms of a collaborative approach to the pandemic. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I mean, we've already heard this, and I don't want to. No, previous slide. Previous slide, please. Yes, as I've indicated, we experiencing a next slide. We're experiencing a world in turmoil. We are presently dealing with the pandemic. In terms of the environment itself, there's land degradation, there's climate change happening. Our food security systems are under threat, and in the context of increasing population growth. And then we have the onset of the fourth industrial revolution to embrace as well. So these complex issues are creating a radically different and diverse context for the present leadership in society. And when I speak about leadership, I'm talking about our leaders in society, but I'm also talking about the individual itself as well. So next slide, please. So in terms of the biodiversity sector itself, we in South Africa are a mega diverse country. And what does that mean? It means that we have a lot of biodiversity, a lot of variety in our natural systems. And this is a vibrant biodiversity sector. It serves for many jobs. There's trade in biodiversity. We have conservation and protected areas. There's interfaces with the agriculture, tourism, mining, and water, and all these sectors actually contribute towards the vibrant biodiversity sector. Next slide, please. So in terms of, what is our overarching policy position with respect to the biodiversity that we have? There's dedicated programs for the conservation of biodiversity, but we also use the biodiversity, the biological resources. So there's sustainable use of biological resources. And then there's the fair and equitable benefit sharing that arises from the use of these biological or genetic resources. And this resonates the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is actually cascades down into our national legislations and policies. Next slide, please. So some of the features, as I mentioned, of the biodiversity sector, for many, the sector is an employer of choice. There's, as you've heard, there's a lot of work being done in terms of research and science, a lot of expertise as well. It's also the management of the biodiversity. It's quite important. The sector also underpins the livelihoods and lifestyles of society broadly, globally, regionally, nationally, and locally as well. So because of all these activities, there's a need for development, enforcement, compliance of legislation and policy. because to a large extent we work with the biodiversity, we eat the biodiversity, we live with the biodiversity, we use the biodiversity. There's many materials, natural materials that come from the biodiversity: food, materials, products, medicines. We research and study the biodiversity, and then we trade the biodiversity. Next slide, please. So, in terms of what has this whole virus has what impact has it had on the sector itself? Our human activities, in one way or another, have resulted in the rise of pandemics, and as you've heard from previous presentations, this is not a new issue. There's been impact on human life. There's been loss. It has impacted on our well-being, on our healthcare. There's impact on the economy, the loss of income, job losses, loss of assets. It has a huge impact on the tourism industry because people can't travel, lockdowns, etc. And the impact on the environment. There's been revealed an interconnection with many processes, and then zoonosis as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the impact on the environment itself, and again, you've heard this previously in many of the other presentations, there's this deep seated interconnectedness of humans, animals, and their shared environment. And then again, zoonosis, these diseases like COVID are caused by microorganisms that infect our bodies. And again, as you've heard previously, this is not a new process. More than 70% of all emerging diseases affecting people have originated in the wildlife and domesticated animals. Pandemics are, however, caused by activities that bring about increased numbers of people into direct contact and often in conflict with the animals that that carry these pathogens. The biodiversity sector, and if you look at around the world, the biodiversity during these lockdown processes, you could see that the biodiversity was recovering to a certain extent because of the restrictions on economic activity. We found that actually, the biodiversity was coming back. In Cape Town, we had penguins crossing the roads, so to a large extent, which was previously never heard of. And so this is an indication that conservation and protection are key to ensuring the healthy and sustainable future of the planet. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go too much on this slide, but it's just about zoonotics, what it is about. These diseases have been affecting many countries, as we all experiencing. It's resulted in high morbidity, mortality rates. It has had an adverse effect on the trade, and there's obviously an associated economic costs as well, as was mentioned previously as well. Next slide, please. So in specifically the impact on the biodiversity sector, the pandemic has highlighted trade issues, and you've heard this as well. But there's the regulated trade, which is a formal part of the economy. There's the unregulated trade, which is the informal part of the economy, and then there's the illegal trade, which requires enforcement of legislation, policy, and permits. And all of this is controlled by the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. This is a convention, a multilateral environmental agreement. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the trade issues. The next slide. So the pandemic has also highlighted that there's a nexus between both the health sector, the biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, well-being, and there's interlinkages with climate change. There's biodiversity loss. And then this is all related to the long-term sustainability and economic impact as well within the sector, within the country itself. Next slide, please. The pandemic, just taking a reflection of the sector, it has highlighted from a science and expertise perspective, there is limited evidence in terms of our capacity to actually address the pandemic. There's limited capacity, limited human capacity, and also a very niche kind of approach to specialist knowledge that exists. In terms of the conservation science and social sciences, again looking at the interlinkages between all these cross-disciplinary approaches to the pandemic itself. It has just highlighted that there's not enough information, or maybe there is enough information, but then we have a problem with information management as well. There's again, in terms of species, we don't know enough about all the species that exist out there. And then there's also an issue around foundational biodiversity and the data systems that exist. Next slide, please. So since the onset of the pandemic, of this particular pandemic, there's been a number of publications, discussions have emerged as a result of the crisis. The initial one that was launched last year in April was the traffic report. And there's some of the key messages, again, resonating what I've said so far. There was not enough evidence that trade is responsible for pandemics. The impact is very clear. Concerns on the trade, the movement of live specimens, the mixing of trade, transport, the live markets that was mentioned, disease risk of animals under stress. The pathways could be legal or illegal, as I mentioned. The illegal trade also brings a lot of risks as well, and the lack of connectivity between the global, national, and local practices. And again, this is a lot is coming out of the Convention for International Trade of Endangered Species. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 is reframing how we actually look at risk management, understanding better the risks, what aspects of trade are linked to zoonotic disease at the local level, at the international level, what are the trends, mapping the risks, the species, the markets, transport hubs, trade practices, understanding risk management options, and then adopting an integrated approach towards public health, animal health, conservation, and obviously a wider perspective is needed. I mean, in the biodiversity sector, you're experiencing biodiversity loss, economic impact. There's increased use of medicinal plants and species perceived as a lower risk. There's specific action to mitigate wildlife trade risks, and then the impact of wildlife, the illegal wildlife trade, poaching, and then we need to put in place incentives and look at other regulatory measures. Next slide, please. So as I seen in Wanda's presentation, she mentioned the IPBES report, and I just very quickly highlight what some of the key highlights from this report. The platform conducted research on biodiversity and pandemics, and some of the highlights were that pandemics emerge from microbial biodiversity that is found in nature, the human ecological disruption and unsustainable consumption that drives the pandemic risk. Land use change, agricultural expansion, and urbanization causes more than 30% of emerging disease events. The trade and consumption of wildlife is a globally important risk that is going to lead to future pandemics, and reducing anthropogenic global environmental change may reduce pandemic risk as well. Next slide, please. What is the sector saying about the pandemic? What the department did was carry out a nationwide or even a regional-wide stakeholder engagement, and then we looked at what is government saying, what are the entities like your research entities linked to government. In terms of risk management needs to be elevated and capacitated, identify the aspects of the sector that are high risk, take a precautionary approach on a sector, on a case by case basis, monitor supply chains, and again, Wanda mentioned biosurveillance. Has been coming out a lot in many of the comments or inputs from the sector itself. And then on the zoonosis itself, it's not a new issue. There's a lot of information on this issue. I think it just needs to be coordinated better and filter into government processes as well as research. The research, there needs to be a kind of conduit from the universities into government processes. And I'm not going to go further into that, but then it's there, developing long-term risk minimization strategy, for example, looking at the conditions of markets. So these are all areas of research or evidence gathering that is needed. Next slide, please. So in terms of conservation and protected areas, use the conservation data that exists in South Africa and quantify the impact, the real impact, identify risks on protected areas itself, look at the porous borders, fencing issues, on capacity. Regulations are not consistent across provinces and outside country borders. So again, more monitoring and enforcement is needed. Strengthen the networks, build capacity of the regulatory system, address the scientific capacity of the entities, the provinces. As I mentioned, this is an issue the pandemic has highlighted the lack of scientific capacity. Cross-sector and international cooperation, establish or strengthen cross-sector policy platforms, need for political, regional, and international commitments on bringing all these various multilateral environmental agreements and policies together. We definitely need to work together. CITES, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on Migratory Species, and then linking it up to the national legislation. So a continent-wide multidisciplinary approach is needed. Next slide, please. From the NGOs and interest groups on trade, conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of zoonotic disease risk from wildlife use and trade, with recommendations on remedial changes needed in the policy and legislation, tighter regulations on legal markets. The wildlife legislation and regulation needs to effectively monitor and control ranching, captive breeding, import and export and sale of live animals, as well as of meat and other products and other derivatives for human consumption. On the veterinary side, veterinary and animal health legislation and regulations to ensure husbandry, production, processing, distribution, and introduction of products of wild animal origin, necessary mechanisms to reduce future risks of transmission between domestic agricultural and the wildlife itself, strengthen measures required to ensure the traceability or certification of wildlife specimens, including public health considerations that need to be incorporated, the social behavior change through communication, based upon evidence, scientific evidence. Again, whatever information is needed, it needs to get out there. It needs to get out to society in various aspects. Next slide, please. Again, looking at the socioeconomic impacts, conduct a comprehensive assessment of the economic impact of the COVID-19. And again, this was mentioned. We need to look at the wildlife trade activities, strengthen measures to ensure the legality and sustainability of the wildlife sector, the timber, fisheries, harvest and prevention of overexploitation and unsustainable use, guidance for a sustainable wildlife meat sector within the wildlife economy, consider mechanisms to enable local domestic hunting and tourism activities. Next slide, please. Again, on the protected area management, development of poverty reduction and livelihood strategies, enact short-term emergency budgeting and funding mechanisms or measures, development of strategies to explore conservation initiatives that support and regenerate nature, long-term identification of innovative, sustainable financing mechanisms. There's a huge drive in the country for resource mobilization at the moment. In terms of conservation, conduct assessments of the impact of the COVID-19 outbreak and its economic repercussions, particularly on poaching, illegal trade in South Africa, identify law enforcement weaknesses and vulnerabilities, monitor any changes to the illicit supply chains, existing bans on illegal wildlife trade should be enforced and bolstered up. Welfare standards, again, looking at this particular area. Next slide, please. Again, this was mentioned before. One Health approach has been resonating throughout the inputs received from the sector itself. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this in later slides. Next slide, please. So what specifically is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services saying? Governments must ensure that the actions being taken to reduce the impacts of the current pandemic aren't themselves amplifying the risks of future outbreaks and crises. There are three important areas: strengthening and enforcement of environmental regulations, only deploy stimulus packages that offer incentives for more sustainable and nature positive activities, adopt a One Health approach. This is coming out again and again. We have to properly fund and resource the health systems and incentivize behavior change on the front lines of pandemic risk, build health capacity, conduct behavioral risk surveys, offer viable and sustainable alternatives to high-risk economic activities. Next slide, please. And on the global level, we are entering the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And then there's a whole new talk about a new deal for people and nature. This is coming out of the Convention on Biological Diversity in the development of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So there's a lot of expectations for a new deal for people and nature and how we work together, live with the biodiversity, live with nature. Regionally, on the African Union side, from the Specialized Technical Committee for Agriculture, Rural Development, Water and Environment, there's a ministerial declaration that ensures that appropriate environmental policies and strategies responding to epidemics and pandemics are put in place, and that they are implemented effectively to promote environmental sustainability. Nationally, we are looking at a revised white paper on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity for the country, and this is a process in play, going to be initiated in this year. Next slide, please. So what is our particular approach? So it is to, from the sector itself and from the department side, we want to develop a biodiversity sector response to zoonotic diseases at the human-animal environment interface. And zoonotics, as we've heard, that zoonotics are connected, interconnected to various sectors, including the biodiversity, health, and agriculture. So the sector, biodiversity sector response needs to actually look at these zoonotic diseases, look at this One Health approach, which promotes coordination, cross-sectoral dialogue, and collaboration amongst the various sectors at national, regional, and international levels, and address these common problems. The plan needs to include interventions for the prevention and control of these emerging zoonotic diseases that benefit all sectors with a view to optimize health for human, animal, and the environment. The next slide, please. So what does this actual sector response entail? It entails conducting a scoping exercises on the interlinkages between the biodiversity, and this is very much a desktop study, but then it can include more what is out there itself. Undertake a comprehensive risk assessment of all these issues, undertake a comprehensive mapping and analysis of the full scope of the infrastructure, the resources, the role players that are needed, the regional and international obligations, and then develop a biodiversity sector response for the next 10 years of implementation, outlining what needs to be done in the short, medium, and long term. Again, it obviously needs to be supported by resources and for action on the ground, both in the short, medium, and long term. Next slide, please. So, I mean, what has been resonating throughout my presentation and as well as through other presentations is that this One Health approach needs to actually be implemented worldwide, across regionally, nationally, and globally as well. And then from a South African perspective, emerging from my own research, developing a co-creation model that is looking more and more towards these interdependencies between various processes. What is unpacking the leadership in itself, looking at the various contexts, looking at the value co-creation, and looking at how the society and on the soft issues as well. So these are all, this is a wedding cake model for the SDGs that was adapted to actually create this co-creation model in support of a One Health approach. Next slide, please. I think I'm up for time as well. And some of the key principles emerging from this co-creation model, just to bring it all together, the leadership is interdependent on the interactions of key tenants that promote and optimize processes. Relationships matter. Establish the relevance of local context. Context is important. We need to establish trust and build credibility, ensure transparency and inclusiveness, promote conservation and conversation, and not conversation and dialogue as often as possible, develop strategic partnerships and relationships, reward and incentivize, and promote this continuous co-creation. So we have to actually create a culture of co-creation or co-development. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide in terms of not keeping anyone behind. And this was an initiative by my son, my 9-year-old son in grade 4. And I think this has had a huge impact on society, on our youth as well. And I think we need to harness the co-creation, or the creativity and the innovation from our youth. So yeah, I think it's brought a smile to the chair's face. So I think yeah, let's just embrace the creativity of our society. Thank you very much.